against empiricism. I'm going to talk about empiricism in a moment, but one of the things I will be talking about in this talk is induction, as you'll see. Induction, very standardly articulated this way. From all observed Fs are Gs, we infer they're all Fs and Gs, the observed and the unobserved, whether that's because the unobserved are in the future, or they're in the past or present, but we're not, or we haven't been in the right place to actually observe them. And then people will add, perhaps the conclusion isn't certain. It's a probabilistic conclusion tempered by, by how many Fs you've got around to observing. You might be Reichenbach and change the all to the relevant, generalize to relevant proportion and so forth. Okay. So now, have I said anything at all controversial? No, everybody accepts that's a standard way of introducing what induction is, and you might be going on to talk about Hume's problem, as I will later. But I think it's highly controversial. This is a good way to articulate what induction is. I mean, it's really everybody does it this way. That in articulating induction, we refer to the all observed Fs, and we see this in, for example, Leo Henderson's article in the Stanford Encyclopedia on induction. They are inferences from the observed to the unobserved, or Jan Sprenger in the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy of Science, the entry on induction. It's a method of inference based on experience. Experience is used interchangeably with observation and evidence. Okay, so this seems to me to be really weird. I mean, after all, why should the source of our knowledge of the premises of an argument be relevant to characterizing the very nature of the inference? It's not as if anybody in characterizing what deductive inferences are or rules of deductive inference, it says, and the premises have to be known in this way. And that seems most peculiar. If we don't do that in deductive logic, why should we do it when we're talking about induction? No, so why am I saying this? I'm saying this because if you didn't find that characterization of induction at all odd, for the reason you didn't think the reasons I've given as reason to thinking that was odd, at least when it was first presented, then you are a tacit empiricist, and you are part of the problem. And you need re-education, and your re-education starts now. Okay, so the original title for this talk, which it might have been advertised earlier on, was An Anti-Empiricist Rant. And just in case anybody was here hoping for some ranting, I thought I would get some ranting in, just so that you got what you came for. There'll be a bit later on. But there is a serious point to this, is that most philosophers of science are, to some extent or other, sort of tacitly empiricist. But at the same time, I think most philosophers of science are less tacitly, more openly realists, scientific realists. But I want to argue that there's a tension between those two, and that if you're a realist, you should give up any kind of empiricism. Okay, so this is what I'm going to be arguing, and it's all really bound up with epistemological internalism. So I'm going to be arguing that empiricism plus epistemological internalism that combination is incompatible with scientific realism, but empiricism without internalism is simply unmotivated. Being an internalist is the only good reason to be an empiricist. So we can conclude either you should be a scientific realist. If you want to be a scientific realist, you should get rid of internalism, and you should not be an empiricist either. Or you stick with your empiricism, motivated by internalism, in which case you are going to be an anti-realist. Okay, so that's the form of the argument that I'm going to be employing. So empiricism, well, what is it? I'm just going to regard it as any epistemology that gives a core, central or foundational role to perception or sense experiences, or if you were a Rees-Mogg style empiricist, to ideas. Okay, so that sort of thing. Okay, so if in philosophy of science we think that notions like evidence and observation are central to our epistemology of science, then things like this count as empiricist. The definition of evidence in terms of experience, or Hassok Chang definition of observation in terms of sensation. Chang's an anti-realist of a kind, but Anjan Chakravarti is a realist. But he gives more or less the same kind of definition of observable in terms of experience. So this is just to show that a lot of people are empiricists by this standard. I shall note right at the end, scientists aren't empiricists by this standard. In the written version of the paper, I use, and I'm thinking possibly one or two of the lines in this paper, I use the observable subscript P to mean observable in this empiricist sense, because that's the way it's typically used, as we see in philosophy of science, although I think it shouldn't be. Okay, so you might think, look, if Alexander's anti-empiricist, he must be pro-rationalist. No, that's wrong. I'm not. I reject both empiricism and rationalism. I think that whole debate, the old-fashioned debate, is a mistake, because both wings of that debate are looking to find epistemological foundations in something that is certain. They just disagree about where that certainty is to be found. So the rationalist thinks that it can't be experienced, or can't be just experienced, because we need some rational foundation for thinking that experience tells us about the world. We need irrational intuition, some argument like Descartes to tell us that clear and distinct ideas are likely to be true. The empiricist responds that the experience can give us this kind of certainty. That's to say, certainty in the sense of when the proposition such that when we believe it, we know that we can't be wrong. So the empiricist response, well, perhaps that experience or perception considered subjectively or internally can have that kind of certainty. We find this kind of empiricism, obviously, in the likes of Berkeley and then Mill, who, although he didn't have the same metaphysics as Berkeley, nonetheless had the sense that his definition of observation is as subjective sense experience. And he says that we use the term observation to refer to things, our perceptions of things in the world, but he says that that's actually really the result of that's the result of a quick and subconscious inference from the true observation of our inner states to the external world. And obviously the protocol debate between Schlick and Neurath was centered around, as it were, whether one should prioritize this kind of certainty, which Schlick thought you should, or you should move away from that degree of certainty and move to a sort of more objective or intersubjective, so-called physicalist notion of experience or observation that allows for observations of things in the world, but keeps us close to the certainty that we get in subjective experience. Okay, so that's so empiricism is looking for these epistemological foundations in certainty. Rationalism was trying to do the same thing. And that search for certainty belief being certain when you know that you can't be wrong is motivated by epistemological internalism. So what's internalism? Well, yeah, there are various ways of characterizing epistemological internalism, although it's not really going to make a big difference to what I have to say, which of these is correct. But yeah, here's one articulation. Someone is justified, it could be done in terms of knowledge, but a subject is justified in believing some proposition P if that subject is in a position and can become aware by reflection or aware of all the facts that are relevant to S's justification for P. Yeah, roughly, that if there's someone, if they are justified, then they're in a position to know that they're justified. So an externalist will reject this internalism. Now, of course, there are a lot of accounts of justification and knowledge that count as externalist. But here's one, simple reliabilism. So this is, you say that the subject is justified in their belief if and only if that belief is the result of a reliable process of belief formation. So again, not much is going to depend upon my referring to simple reliabilism here. It's probably false. There are various objections to it, counterexamples. But the point is that it stands as a simple example of externalism, clearly externalist, because all that's required for justification is that the process of belief formation actually be reliable. S doesn't have to be in any position to be aware of the fact that it is reliable. Okay, and so we'll use that as one of our principal examples of externalism. Okay, so let's move on. So here's an argument that I call the pessimistic deduction. Okay. So it's a deductive argument. And the first premise is the empiricist premise that the evidence of science concerns only what is observable. Second premise, the conclusions of science do concern what is unobservable. Third premise goes like this: no conclusion concerning what is unobservable can reasonably be drawn from evidence solely concerning the observable, and from which we draw the conclusion that we can't have a reasonable belief in the conclusions of science. So that's what I call the pessimistic deduction. And I think that something like this is at work in some of the epistemological anti-realist arguments, and anti-realist arguments stemming from the underdetermination of theory by evidence by observation, or whatever you want to call it. So that's the that's the premise that is the typical locus of a disagreement between realists and anti-realists. Anti-realists think this is correct, but realists will say, no, this is not correct because we can use inference to the best explanation to bridge the gap between the unobservable and the observable. So I regard as the debate, that realism debate is really a debate between optimistic empiricists versus pessimistic empiricists. So the optimistic empiricists say, no, we can get from the unobservable to the observable by use of inference, the best explanation. The pessimistic empiricists say you can't. Okay, so, but I think why am I focusing on that? Oh, yeah. No, I'm focusing on this for a reason. So I just need to be able to see on my screen. That's right. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to. So what I'm really complaining about is the fact that people don't discuss the first premise enough. But I want to go briefly via those people who actually deny premise 2. So in effect, I'm really talking here about the constructive empiricists, or well, Van Fraassen plus your small band of followers, because in effect, the constructive empiricist says that, strictly speaking, the conclusions of science don't really concern what is unobservable. I mean, they talk about the unobservable, but we don't really believe those conclusions. We only accept them. What we believe is that they are empirically adequate. But the belief that some proposition is empirically adequate, even if that proposition mentions the unobservable, the belief that it's empirically adequate itself is not about the observable. So there's a sense in which the constructive empiricist wants to deny the conclusion, that it's unreasonable to believe in the conclusions of science of the pessimistic deduction by denying this premise. So briefly, I want to say why I think this premise is true, or put it brief, why Van Fraassen is just wrong. Okay, and the reason why he's wrong is that constructive empiricism simply can't make sense of what goes on in most of modern science. So just think about what goes on in radio astronomy. So here's the example. So this involves the use of radio telescopes to investigate the history of the cosmos by detecting radio frequency electromagnetic radiation. And a lot of important discoveries have been made by it. The discovery of pulsars by Jocelyn Bell, and then also most importantly, perhaps, of the cosmic microwave background by Penzias and Wilson. And that's the most important piece of evidence supporting the Big Bang theory. So the radio telescope, your modern one, detects weak signals, uses a series of electronic amplifiers to increase signal strength. The signals are then digitized, stored in a database, where the database can be interrogated by scientists using appropriate software, so, for example, for statistical analysis. And you can link the signals from these digitized signals from several widely separated telescopes in a technique known as radio interferometry, which gives you a much higher resolution signal. Again, the process of comparison of signals is automated. The astronomer's engagement with the process of observation is through the analysis of digitized and highly processed electronic data. Okay, so what in this case counts as the empirical adequacy of a relevant theory, say of the theory of the cosmic microwave background radiation. Okay, so given that the scientist's engagement with her instrument is entirely through her computer terminal. So it looks to be, so her perceptual experiences, what she observes in the empiricist sense of observation, is her computer terminal. The empirical adequacy of the relevant theory would be something like this. It would be, if a radio telescope is constructed to these specifications and you run this software to analyze the data, and you type these commands into your laptop or your computer terminal, then she will have these visual experiences on looking at her screen. Now, that's crazy, right? There's some ranting going on here, okay. That's crazy. Why on earth should anybody be interested in the truth of that proposition? Okay. Now, of course, you might think, oh, well, perhaps there are other propositions that relate relevant theories to your CMBR theory to experience. But there aren't any. I mean, I just challenge you to find any that aren't. any that make that connection. I just think that the constructive empiricism is simply crazy, because it just doesn't make sense of science, of most modern science, which is highly automated, and our engagement through it is through the processing of software. Just think what goes on at CERN and your Large Hadron Collider and the Atlas experiments there. Okay, so I think we can move on from that to the main structure of the argument. Okay, so what I'm going to do is quickly run through responses to Hume's problem of induction. I won't waste time or insult anybody by telling you what the problem is, but there are three kinds of response. Okay, I mean, there's zillions of actual responses, but I think the straight responses can be categorized as doing one of three things. One, look, you can accept the problem, as having a skeptical conclusion. Okay, so yeah, Popper seminar. Popper's does the accept thing. You can reject it by saying that the problem depends upon making internalist assumptions, and so you just simply reject the internalist assumptions. So if you adopt some kind of reliabilism, you just say the problem can be dissolved. In a world where that's nice and regular, there is uniformity of nature. In such a world, someone who uses induction will end up having justified beliefs. That's what simple reliabilism says. Okay, so you might have some different form of externalism, but the point is that if you're an externalist, you're in a position to reject Hume's problem of induction. A lot of people do that. Papineau, Meller, Van Cleve, a whole raft of people have that response to Hume's problem. The last one is to try an a priori justification for induction. Look, we could spend all day arguing about what one can do about this, and whether Bayesianism counts as an a priori justification for induction, or whether it's actually not as it were a straight response to induction. We can argue about that. My own view is, well, look, we can do the reject thing about, okay, this was repeating what I was saying a few moments ago, perhaps clicking a bit too slowly. So if you take the externalist response, you can show that inductive justification is possible. And furthermore, if you want, you can run a rule circular inductive argument to show that, to argue on a posteriori grounds, an inductive justification of induction, to get the conclusion we are in fact justified in using induction. Of course, this rule circularity is one that the externalist will be happy with, but the internalist you completely reject. They think that is Hume's problem of induction, is this circularity, and it's wrong to have a rule circularity is bad as well. Okay, so I should have done that before going on to the a priori justification. Look, I happen to think that, okay, in the nod to the empiricists, if that's our notion of induction, I think the new riddle of induction shows that there can't be any a priori justification of induction understood in that, the empiricist way, or indeed in any other way, because what one needs is to distinguish, as it were, the good F's and G's from the bad ones, the greens from the grus, and there just isn't going to be any a priori way of doing that. But yeah, nothing's going to hang on in my argument on specifically rejecting this way of responding to Hume's problem. Okay, so what I'm going to do is show that when it comes to the important premise 3, similar things are going on. So this is whether we can have an argument that moves from the unobservable to the observable rather than the unobserved to the observed. Yeah, so I think this is the locus of much of the realism, anti-realism debate. I think one can show, but I won't do it for reasons of time, that there's an analogue of Hume's problem that shows that we don't have abductive knowledge or abductively justified belief. I think that's reasonably plausible that there is such an analogue. And then you can reject that skeptical problem, the one that Peter Lipton calls Voltaire's problem, by going externalist and saying that the problems in question depend upon internalist assumptions. You could try looking for an a priori justification. The point about an a priori justification in all of these cases is it allows you to remain internalist without being taking on the skeptical conclusion of accepting these skeptical arguments. That just seems to be utterly okay. So let's just talk about the externalist response. This, again, a simple reliabilism should suggest that abductive justification is possible. Then there's similarly in the literature rule circular abductive argument to show that abductive justification is actual. So we get this in the Boyd Silot's version of the no miracles argument, which is consciously a rule circular argument using inference as the best explanation to show that inference of this best explanation is indeed reliable. Okay, so there's these externalist responses. Okay, and as I say, the a priori approach doesn't, it seems to me, well, I think Igor Duvin in Stanford Encyclopedia says it's hopeless. Yeah, and I think that's probably right. Okay, so I'm going to move on to two further arguments, skeptical arguments, anti-realist arguments that an empiricist should accept. And these are arguments from the importance of testimony and instruments in science. So testimony, it's clear that thanks to the scale of the testimony is really important in science. So for example, even in the most simple experiments, baby ones that we did at school, like knowing that magnesium burns with a white flame. How do you know that? Well, we did the experiment. You stuck the magnesium in the flame. You saw it burn with this bright white flame. But of course, even then, knowing that bit of metal you stuck in the Bunsen burner is magnesium, you only know that because your teacher told you that. But we think that we can nonetheless get knowledge by testimony by an argument like this. So if you're an empiricist, you will want to have an argument to show that you should accept this testimony. And the argument will go something like this, and you will want to be able to show by experience that the relevant premises are true. Well, that someone asserted something to you, that can be got from experience, but you need to have some way of showing the second premise, the major premise that they are a reliable informant is true. Well, you will hope that you will have had enough experience of S and being able to check what they say in the past has turned out to be correct, that you can establish that they are a reliable informant. But of course, you'll need to do that checking by using your own experience to see that what, at least in many cases, what they have said turns out to be true. But the problem is that the scale of the division of labour in science makes the second premise really very difficult to establish, certainly to establish by means acceptable to the empiricists. There's just so much science, and there's so much, as it was, division of labour. Scientists from one field depend upon the results of scientists in quite different fields. So if you're an anthropologist, you're a paleontologist, you will depend upon radiometric dating to know the dates of your bones and the rocks they're found in. But you're not required to be, or in position to be, an expert in in nuclear physics, the theory behind radiometric dating. So what's known as the reductionist, or Adler calls the empiricist account of testimony, it just seems to be a no-hoper. So we've got a skeptical argument from testimony. We've got to reject reductionism if you're an empiricist. You've got this skeptical argument. And as before with the case of the problem of induction, we've got three possible responses. You can accept the skeptical argument and be an anti-realist on the basis of this argument. You can reject the argument for externalist reasons, to give an externalist account of testimony, as does Goldberg fairly recently, or you can try and find an a priori justification. So here are examples of the three responses. John Locke's a skeptic about testimony. That's what he says. Anyway, we'll move on. But Locke's an example of the skeptic about testimony. So he'd have difficulty in. He would have reason to be anti-realist about most of modern science. As I said, Sanford Goldberg has a reliabilist account. It's a bit more sophisticated than the simple reliabilism that we saw earlier on, but it's a recent example of a highly articulate reliabilist defense of testimony. There is a third, the principal element is this reliabilist condition, number one. There is a requirement that the hearer can reliably discriminate amongst speakers between those who are reliable and those who aren't. That isn't a return to internalism. It's very clear that that's not what that is doing. It's supposed to rule out analogues of fake barn cases. But we could talk about that later if you want. But I say, look, there is a reliabilist response. Speakers can be reliable, and if you are lucky to be talking to one, then you get to know or to have justified belief. So, and science can be like that. Okay. I've got a lot more to say about that if you want. There is an a priori response. So this response would allow one to remain internalist, but reject the skeptical argument. So that would be good. That would be a good way of being perhaps an empiricist. If you can swallow a certain amount of a priori argument, and without being a skeptic or an anti-realist. So Tyler Burge has tries an a priori justification of testimony. He says we're entitled to rely on testimony, amongst other things, the word of others. He has some complicated argument that merely understanding what someone is saying requires us to think of them as rational, but if we think of them as rational, then rationality has to do with being able to detect the truth and so forth. And therefore, we should think that speakers are likely to be reliable, likely to tell the truth. Look, that argument, and we can go into more detail about what it is. Even if an empiricist is willing to swallow that amount of a priority, they should still reject the argument because it's very weak. It only establishes a tendency to tell the truth, if it establishes anything at all. But I don't think it does even that. At most, it establishes that someone who's telling you something is in a position to tell you the truth. It doesn't follow that they are actually inclined so to do. So I think that that this is a hopeless way of defending testimony, and so we should avoid this one. The real options are the accept the skeptical argument or reject it on externalist grounds. Okay, and okay, so for my last skeptical argument, instruments. I love instruments because they are just absolutely essential to science. Okay. So here's the argument that you needed, the empiricists needed to establish as sound in the case of testimony. And there's an analogous argument that I think needs to be established as sound in the case of use of an instrument. So an instrument delivers output with certain contents, telling you that the value of the magnitude of a current in a wire is 2.5 milliamps. Major premise that this is a reliable instrument, and therefore you can draw the conclusion that in this case, the current in the wire really is 2.5 milliamps. Okay, the problems are really just the same, and it's the matter of establishing the major premise. So just as we should, I mean, I think that and we can talk about this, about why the empiricist should reject the major premise that we can check that our instruments are reliable. The empiricist has a good way of establishing that some simple instruments are reliable. I mean, most obviously, in optical telescope, we can say, look, you can see through it and you seem to see how things are far away, and then you can walk up to them if they're not too far away and check that the telescope was telling you stuff correctly, and then you might infer that it is going to be generally reliable. But for most of the instruments in science, that kind of empiricist checking their reliability just isn't available to us. Instruments measure magnitudes that we don't have a perceptual, any perceptual leverage on whatsoever. Gauss meter telling us the strength of a magnetic field. It's not as if, as it were, we can test out some cases where we can use our senses to check that this thing is reliable in an empiricist acceptable kind of way. So I think that the empiricists who are skeptical about instruments, like Van Fraassen, are right to be skeptical about instruments insofar as they are empiricists. But again, I think I think that there's two responses you can have to these skeptical arguments. One is to accept it, and I think that if you're in a process, you should, or you can reject on by now familiar externalist grounds. That if the instrument is in fact reliable, then under those circumstances, actually using it, whether or not you've established its reliability, is sufficient for justification or knowledge. Okay. Okay. So that was you're talking about instruments. Now we could spend a bit of time thinking about whether people are happy with the externalist response about instruments. I think there are reasons for being unhappy with simple reliabilism with respect to instruments. So after all, people think within science, scientists ought to have some idea about whether their instruments are reliable. They shouldn't just say, well, I have no idea whether this sophisticated piece of equipment is reliable, I'll use it, and that's whatever. Now, people think that one should have a little bit more of a sophisticated sense of why one's instruments are reliable, why they work, and so forth. Is that internalism? Well, I've got some reasons for thinking that it doesn't amount to internalism. There can be reasons why one can have this meta level concern with reliability, being able to establish reliability, that are independent of internalism. But we can talk about that in the discussion section if anybody's interested. I'm not quite sure how long I should go on for, so I'm sort of rushing through, and we can come back to various bits if you want. So, but there I think is an interesting argument about how much we expect scientists to know about their methods if they are to use those methods in science. Okay. So So part of my argument here is that there's no good reason for being an empiricist other than the reasons I gave early on, viz. That empiricism is closely connected with internalism. Internalism is the motivation for being an empiricist, whereas if you're an externalist, there's nothing special about perception. So I, before concluding, want to consider an argument that you might think be a non-internalist justification for empiricism. You might say, look, perception, including this intersubjective, physicalist, external notion of perception. Okay, that's what we're going to found. Yes, we're talking sort of Neurath and after here, and possibly most current empiricists. That doesn't deliver certainty. So we're not interested in it for its certainty or its internalist reasons, but we do think it provides a high degree of reliability and therefore ought to be our foundations for the epistemology of science. I think that this is simply a mistake. Actually, it is, I mean, the image here is, as it were, that Schlick was sort of right, that the certainty would be great if you could have it, but but we can't get into the external world. That's the problem. So we stay as close to Schlick as we possibly can. That will give us the maximum degree of reliability, but being intersubjective, being physical. So yes, so this is why I think sort of Neurath and where Neurath is. So we've got the highest degree of reliability while being able to make sense of science as a sort of physicalist enterprise. But I think that's a mistake because actually instruments provide a greater degree of reliability than our perceptual experiences. So think about thermoception. So we have the ability by perception to tell how hot and cold things are. But as we know, it's highly unreliable, right? You can easily make mistakes about how hot or cold something is. As people have noted long in the past, depending on how hot or cold your hands were previously. And secondly, it's highly imprecise. It's quite hot, very hot, cold. It doesn't have the kind of precision that's required for science. So we can easily make mistakes, and it's not very precise, whereas if you were to use a mercury thermometer, you get much greater precision and reliability. So if reliability is what we're interested in, we would ditch perception for a mercury thermometer. And of course, you can do better than a mercury thermometer because you're using it does depend somewhat sensitively on perception. You can make parallax errors when using it. Mercury thermometer, so you're better off with something like a resistance thermometer with a readout. But better than that, actually, is to have a thermometer that records temperature continuously and feeds those temperatures into a database, and then smooths that. If you does some statistical work on that to give you, say, an average reading over the time period that you're interested in. And that you get out of the database. So that's increasing in both precision and reliability. So if reliability is what you're interested in, perception doesn't give you a high degree of reliability. The sophisticated instruments and methods of science do much better. So I don't think that's a good reason for being an empiricist, a non-internalist empiricist. Okay, so let's get to the conclusion. So this was the pessimistic deduction. It was over premise 3 that much of the argument raged or rages between realists and anti-realists. But I think it's premise 1 that we should, I think that's a reasonable argument to have over P3, but its importance becomes that much less if you reject the first premise. Okay. So that's where I think where the future lies. So how did I argue for this? So I looked at 3 skeptical arguments modelled on responses to the problem of induction. In each case, we can accept these. We could reject them for externalist reasons, or we can reject because we can find some a priori justification. I don't think in any of the cases we considered, those 3 is the a priori response a plausible one. So these are your options. You can accept, you're an internalist and an empiricist, and you end up having to be a skeptic, an anti-realist, or you can reject these skeptical arguments by using externalism, which I think means that your motivation for empiricism is undermined, so you don't have to be an empiricist anymore, and at least allows you to be a realist. I don't think it establishes realism, because there might be other reasons, non-internalist reasons for rejecting realism. Perhaps the pessimistic induction or meta-induction. Okay, so here's the conclusions. The realist should be an externalist, because if they're an internalist, they're going to end up being a skeptic, an anti-realist. The externalist shouldn't be an empiricist because they've got no reason to be an empiricist. It's not that they're inconsistent, it's just your motivation for empiricism is undermined. And therefore, conclusion from 3 follows from 1 and 2 is that the realist should not be an empiricist. And that's great because even realist empiricists, the incoherent bunch, tell us that these things are unobservables, small molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, gravitational waves, and magnetic fields. So it's really peculiar that the philosophers tell us that these things are unobservable, but the scientists observe these things all the time as these are just titles of papers randomly selected from the top journals. Observation of the top quark. Well, that's supposed to be impossible, according to the empiricist philosophers of science. Observations of gravitational waves, and so on and so forth. So I think that the right thing to do is to give up on epistemological internalism. Once you've done that, although I haven't argued for that here, but I think you should. Once you've done that, you don't have to be an empiricist. You have no reason to be. And once that you can do that, you can say all these nice things that the scientists say.